Two women went into labor the same night, one surrounded by nurses, the other by strangers with tired eyes. Both heard the same thunder, both screamed the same pain. But somewhere between the blood and the lightning, a nurse made a choice that would curse them all. Two babies cried that night, but only one truth survived. And when the city finally woke up to what happened in St. Joseph's, it was too late to call it mercy.
It was raining, the kind of rain that washes the dust out of the gutters and makes people hurry with bowed heads. On the long road to St. Joseph's Hospital, two cars moved in the same direction, but carried worlds apart. In the front, polished and solemn, as if it were its own private court, rode Chief Olumide Adebayo's black SUV. Inside the car, his wife, Ifunanya, clutched at the leather seat with both hands. Her face was pale in the light of the phone that displayed ultrasound photos, and she mouthed prayers without sound. Chief Olumide, a man D newspapers called the billionaire and the market called Oga Big, was known for the way he built things: towers, banks, and empire. He was also known for D quiet wound that no amount of money had healed. No child after many years of marriage. Tonight, the wound bled fresh. Behind them, on a battered Okada motorcycle, came Amaka Okereke. Amaka rode pillion, breath torn, stomach heavy with a life that had been punching and turning inside her all day. Her husband, Chinedu, walked beside the motorbike, shoes muddy, hat in hand, face like flint, fierce from worry, soft from love. They were not strangers to hard work. The market, the rent, the loans. They knew names of every hardship and gave each other a kind of wink to say, "We will survive." Amaka had been in labor for hours. She had no money for luxury, only a small cloth with the one name she had chosen for their child. Obinna, child of the heart. St. Joseph's was the kind of hospital that had two faces. One face opened its arms and pocketbooks to Chief Olumide. The VIP wing, with soft carpets, white roses in glass vases, and doctors who sat like generals. The other face had a thin line of chairs and fluorescent lights buzzing with tired resolve, where ordinary people came to be mended. The two women arrived within minutes of each other, and in that small hospital hallway, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ifunanya was shown into a private suite. Nurses fluttered like a well-trained orchestra. Machines were at her bedside like loyal guards. Chief Olumide sat outside the room, hands clasped, all the resources of a life at his disposal. From the best gynecologist in the city to a personal prayer leader. In the public ward, Amaka was led into a room that smelled of antiseptic and tired hope. A young nurse named Blessing, who knew Amaka from church, held her hand. There were no flowers, no generals, only the pulse of steady kindness. The two women cried out in different tones. One voice echoed with the fear of a woman who dreamed of filling her husband's world with a child and felt the future slipping. The other voice carried the simple, raw courage of a woman who had always known life would require her to fight. The nurses checked, murmured, and prepared. The hospital, which had always been a place of miracles and mistakes, arranged itself for what it must deliver that night. Outside the VIP suite, Chief Olumide paced like a man waiting on a verdict. In the ward, Chinedu whispered encouragements to Amaka, his voice soft as crushed leaves. The rain drummed like an anxious crowd. No one yet knew the earthquake that was about to break them all open. The night moved on its own. the kind that makes hours feel like a line of prayers. Amaka's labor came fast and fierce, twin contractions folding into one, another like waves. Nurse Blessing breathed with her, rubbed her back, called on God and every good medicine she could think of. When the first baby slipped into the world, the cry was immediate and strong, a voice like a small drum. Blessing wrapped him and held him close to Amaka's chest. Relief ran through the room like a warm current. Then, to everyone's astonishment, and then to sorrow, a second delivery arrived. The second baby came with the same small, stubborn strength. For a moment, both babies wailed, and Amaka's tears were a violent, joyful rain. She counted them quickly with her heart. 1, 2, both here. Chinedu laughed in disbelief and touched his wife's hand as if to confirm she was awake. At the VIP wing, the mood was different. Ifunanya fought for air with every breath, and Dr. Okechukwu, the best obstetrician Chief Olumide's money could hire, fought to steady both her body and the monitors that screamed like distant thunder. When the child was born, the room held one painful, inhuman second of silence. Then the machines whispered a cold truth. The baby did not cry. Doctors worked with the clinical calm of those who have seen mercy and its opposite. They called for oxygen, for injections, for prayers. Chief Olumide stood by the doorway as if the world had split into a line that he could cross only with permission. When the worst happened and the child could not be revived, Ifunanya's face folded like paper. For Chief Olumide, years of hope crashed on the shore of one blue-lit night. The life he had imagined, a little foot, a laugh, a lineage, stopped like a broken clock. His grief was a stove. It burned everything near it. Ifunanya, however, was not thinking only of grief. Her world, built by the hands of a husband who had shown his weakness to this wound, trembled beneath her. She saw his face grow harder every minute. She knew the man who could build cities, yet break under the shame of childlessness. Panic moved under her skin like an animal. The thought that he might leave, that he might become unmoored, pressed on her like weight. Desperation does strange things to conscience. Across the hospital corridor, in the dim ward, Nurse Blessing took Amaka's hand and hummed an old lullaby. Amaka held both babies to her chest and counted their fingers like rosary beads. Chinedu fell asleep with the side of his face pressed to the cot, whispering future plans, names, school fees, the little shop they would open. Ifunanya's suite was a world of monitors and hush, and it was there that a thought took root, a thought like a serpent, dangerous and quick. What if no one knew? What if one baby could move into the golden house and the other be returned to the poor family, hidden as some small mercy? She did not yet have a plan. She only had fear. And in the hospital's dim administrative office sat a man who had earned the respect of society by adding integrity to his title. The CMD, Chief Medical Director, Dr. Emeka Nwosu. He was a man people trusted. He had in him a kindness and a prestige that made people feel safer. And that made his consent a powerful thing. Ifunanya sent for him. Dr. Emeka Nwosu was a public figure whose name opened doors. He had been in charge of St. Joseph's for decades, wearing his reputation like a talisman. People said he would not sell a pen. He had smiled at bishops and street vendors with the same soft dignity. Which was why, when Ifunanya arrived at his office like a small storm, clutching a wafer of panic and very little sleep, he listened. She did not come with threats. She came with trembling logic. Emeka, she said, not waiting for formalities. You know what my husband is going through. He has tried everything for a child. If he knew the baby's gone." Her voice cracked. She spoke of the likely ruin, not in money, but in the ruin that money could not reach. The unraveling pride of a man who had built his life on being able to hold all possibilities. Dr. Emeka watched her. His training told him to be calm, ethical, to think of both mothers, both lives. He looked at her hands. They were shaking with something other than grief. Ifunanya unfolded an envelope and placed it on his table. He saw the edge of banknotes. It is hard to explain exactly why a man who had lived on honor would consider a choice he had once scorned. Maybe it was the mirror of Ifunanya's fear, the raw animal begging in her eyes. Maybe it was the memory of his own child's face at home, the bills waiting on his table, the small loans that had become heavy. Maybe it was the quiet hope that his life, already full of respect, would be safer if there were no scandal. Men make decisions from many places, in most cases unpleasant ones. He accepted. The exchange was quiet, executed with the secrecy of people who wanted to feel that they were doing something compassionate. Emeka instructed Nurse Blessing to bring the newborns to his office under the pretense of routine observation. There, with a hand that trembled more than his voice, he told Blessing to cradle one child and to prepare the other for transfer. Blessing, who had been with Amaka through blood and prayer, hesitated. She had heard both babies cry. She had seen Amaka hold them like treasures. But the CMD spoke with a voice that brooked no argument, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. The plan was ugly in its simplicity. One baby would be given to Chief Olumide and Ifunanya to fill a grief with a borrowed joy. The other, the child from Ifunanya, who would not open his eyes again, would be placed in the arms of Amaka, who would not be told of the exchange. For the poor family, a dead child would be offered as if it were the only one, a lie wrapped in a doctor's assurance. Amaka, exhausted and delirious with joy at first and then with the pain of labor, heard the sounds of two infants and believed the world had finally answered. A young nurse leaned close to her, and with a professional paternalism that would haunt Blessing later, told her, there was just one cry after. You are tired. You probably didn't hear the second. She was given a single blanket, a single bassinet tea. They wrapped one baby and took him to the VIP room, saying the transfer was for observation. Amaka was left with the memory of two cries, hammered into silence by medical authority. Blessing watched the exchange. Her heart hurt in a way that made her hands numb. She had a choice: expose them and ruin the lives of the people who trusted the hospital, or bend and cover the lie and brace the consequences. Fear is a strong thing. So is money. So is the idea that one person's secret can save another's marriage. They did not speak of it after. They never said the words out loud. The hospital resumed its lights and its clean surfaces, as if nothing had happened in the dark. But in the small rote of memory, the smell of newborn milk, the silk of baby skin, a secret settled like ash. Time grew like a stubborn weed. In the Adebayo house, the boy became Tunde, an easy, fashionable name that sat well in the mouth of servants and guests. He grew among marble floors and private tutors, his laughter echoing off chandeliers. Chief Olumide held him with a devotion that stitched the jagged pieces of his heart back together. He watched Tunde sleep and whispered the future into his brow. You will carry my name. You will be the proof that love and legacy can be built. Ifunanya kissed the small head like a woman who had purchased a miracle. In the Okereke compound, Life turned its own wheel. Amaka breastfed one son, Obinna, who was real to every ache of her body and every prayer she had ever whispered. She had the one boy in her arms. But a part of her always carried the phantom of the second cry. Chinedu counted the days he could buy a small plot, a small shop, anything to give his son a better chance. The village hummed with small sympathies and the nicknames people give when they want to remember better days. Years passed. The two boys, Tunde in the world of light and Obinna in the market's shadow, learned different languages. Tunde's speech was polished, his clothes ironed by hands that had been trained to love. Obinna learned to mend nets and make friends with planks of wood. He learned to bargain and to stand in queues. He learned simple truths about hunger and then about being full. What neither boy knew was that they were twins in bone and blood, two branches of the same root pulled into different soils. Amaka found work when Obinna turned 7. She left him with a neighbor and walked into the city to look for any job that could pay for school fees. Fate, with its strange humor, placed her footsteps in front of Chief Olumide's mansion. The gates were high and painted, the nameplate catching the sun. She stood there, heart knocking, and read the letters as if they were a command from a god. Adebayo. She had not come to be noticed by the wealthy family. She came to feed her child and build a future. But the world often gives ironies as gifts. Chief Olumide's house needed a new kitchen hand. They wanted someone who could cook with the memory of market soups, someone who could make comfort out of cassava and hope out of peanuts. Amaka applied. They saw her hands, strong, honest, and they offered her the job. Amaka accepted. What she could not know then, in that moment of relief, was that the house she entered would keep more than wages. It kept the other half of her heart. The Adebayo household had rules as if it were a small kingdom. Amaka learned them quickly: where to sweep, where not to look, how to speak softly in the marble rooms that hummed with air conditioning and power. The staff knew not to ask questions about how she cried sometimes in the cookhouse, and those who did were gently rebuked with the Nigerian idea of privacy. You keep your matter. Chinedu was proud of her. He said she carried dignity like an apron, invisible but necessary. Tunde, the boy who had grown in the big house, returned from boarding school for midterm break. He stepped through the gates with a new height and a walk that made the servants whisper, "The boy will be a man soon." That very afternoon, Amaka heard a laughter she had never heard in that house before. A stumble, a small joke, the slap of 2 feet on polished tile. The cookhouse door creaked, and a boy came in looking for water, shirt untucked, chuckling with the ease of a child who knew he was loved. He looked like a copy of a face she had carried in dreams. For a heartbeat, Amaka's hands froze. The bowl she held slipped. She caught it before it shattered. The boy's face, the nose, the curve of the eyebrow, the small freckle near the temple, all opened like a familiar book. He wore the quiet arrogance of a child who belonged to a house. He laughed, and Amaka saw the curve of a smile she had traced with her finger many nights, prepared every day. He reached out to the steaming pot, and Amaka found herself alone in a storm of recognition. His voice carried a small phrase she used when she sang lullabies, a rhythm she used when she hummed while kneading dough. The resemblance was not only in bone, it was in the way he folded his hands, in the tiny tilt of the head. She wanted to cry out and seize him. She wanted to touch his face and put her palm where the baby's hair had once been. Instead, she wiped a dish and set it down with hands that trembled. Her heart beat like a trapped animal. Memories rose, The double cry in the night, the sharp smells of the ward, the CMD's hand, the exchange. She remembered blessing eyes and a face that had turned away. Amaka stayed, crouched like someone who had been stung, and then she made tea because the kitchen was sensible. You cannot starve your hands of work when your heart needs it, she told no one. Her guilt, if she had any, was folded into the strange hope that maybe her eyes were playing tricks. Maybe the child simply resembled her family. But the more she saw him over the following weeks, the more the resemblance became a drumbeat she could not ignore. Small things become large when a heart is listening for them. It started with a bedtime habit. Tunde, when he was upset, a scraped knee, a scolding, would whisper a phrase his mother had taught him at night. A short prayer in Igbo, a cadence of syllables Amaka used when she soothed Obinna. It was the way he held his fork, the way he frowned at a song on the radio, the strange preference for spicy pepper soup that only certain families in the village had made for generations. Each tiny echo was a small arrow aimed at the fulcrum of Amaka's memory. Amaka began to keep time like a woman mapping the moon. Each afternoon, when Tunde returned from his lessons, she arranged the meals to be ready at the exact moment he walked by the cookhouse. She had excuses. Children need snacks, she would say, but the truth sat like a seed she could not plant because the soil was too complicated. She found allies in unlikely places. A gardener who had worked for the Adebayos for 30 years, Mr. Bassi, recalled seeing Nurse Blessing move between wards the night Tunde had been brought. He had been drunk then and had not paid attention. But something in her eyes, he said over a cup of evening tea in the cookhouse, had made him uneasy. People hide things with their eyes, he said. But memories like that don't disappear. He mentioned a van that had left in a hurry that night, a van with tinted windows and a seam of secrecy. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Chief Olumide's love for Tunde grew like a slow vine. He taught the boy to watch the stock news on television, to smile at cameras, to visit construction sites, where Tunde would throw childish seriousness, accept a hard hat, and nod as if he understood. But sometimes, at night, the private nights where money and power do not reach, Olumide would sit in a chair beside the boy and whisper how he had once almost given up. He saw his sorrow smoothed by the small hands of the child who had arrived. Ifunanya, however, carried a different weight. She watched Tunde as if trying to find a mark on the skin that would tell the story of where he came from. She cherished him fiercely. Yet she also carried the secret like a glass in her hands, fragile, and she feared the moment it might slip. It is one thing to accept a miracle. It is another to build a life on a hidden crime. Dr. Emeka slept poorly. He dreamed of 2 babies, one asleep in his lap and the other wailing at his door. His conscience was a quiet industry. He had taken the money to protect a marriage. Now the money felt like cold stones in his pockets. He made small donations to the poor, to patch the parts of his feelings that a check could not quite reach. Still, there were days when he saw the faces of 2 mothers like 2 moons and could not reconcile the sky. Then, one evening, a visitor arrived at the hospital who held in his hand a photograph from that night. It was an old schoolmate of Chinedu's, who now worked as a junior pathologist. He had not meant to look so far back into records. Curiosity had opened a drawer, and a young nurse's document had fallen out. The photograph showed newborns and notes in a handwriting that said, "Transfer to VIP." It was a small thing, a scrap that could be lost, but for someone listening, it was a bell. The threads of truth trembled. The reveal came not as thunder, but as a slow, unstoppable tide. It began at a small clinic outside the city where blood samples were free on certain days. A neighbor in the compound where Amaka and Chinedu lived had a relative who worked in the hospital's laboratory. Having watched the Adebayo boy for months, the neighbor's curiosity became a hot coal. She suggested quietly that they send a sample. "Just to know," she said. Chinedu agreed with the cautious pride of a man who hoped he might finally be able to say he had done something to help his woman. Amaka, who had been drinking from hope and fear in equal measure, allowed Obinna to give a drop of blood at the clinic that morning. The nurse there was courteous and unremarkable, which is the strangest way miracles begin. In places where nobody is watching, the sample was logged under the name Okereke. A few days later, a technician at the private lab, the same facility used by the high-profile families when they sought second opinions, noticed an odd match. The system produced a flag when the blood patterns were compared to a registry sample taken years ago for a hospital audit. At the same time, Blessing, who had carried the secret for years, could not bear the weight any longer. She had watched the child grow into a man of privilege, had seen how Amaka's eyes followed him like a compass needle returning to true north. Her nights were long with guilt. One night she went to Dr. Emeka and said she could not live with herself. She confessed, voice gone to a thin thing, how 2 babies had been swapped. How she had carried her hands into complicity. She said the truth, as if it were a prayer. Dr. Emeka's facade cracked. The honor he had worn like armor spilled into repentance. He called a meeting in the hospital office with trembling hands. The paper trail unfolded. Transfer slips with dates. Nurse logs with handwriting that matched Blessing's. Financial records of a transaction. And the quiet, incriminating notes that Ifunanya had once slipped into his pocket. It was an ugly mirror in which everyone saw themselves. When the DNA results came back, they were not the soft thing of rumor. They were numbers and certainty. The lab called both families with their grave voices. The Adebayo house answered through a private line. Chief Olumide's face went cold, then furious. Then something like a man who had been struck in a place where pride and pain lived together. Ifunanya went white as a sheet. Amaka, who had come to the lab with Chinedu because the neighbor insisted, sat very still as if the room had been emptied of air. The results read like a judgment. Obinna and Tunde, born the same night, were genetically identical in a way that made them unmistakably twins. Tunde belonged to Amaka and Chinedu. The boy in the mansion was the son of the woman who had once cried in the ward, with both babies in her arms. When Chief Olumide learned the truth, he marched into the hospital like a man walking a battlefield. He demanded answers with the force of a life built on control. The CMD, Dr. Emeka, was called to account. Ifunanya could no longer hide behind the whisper that had bought silence. Nurse Blessing's confession, the DNA evidence, the money exchange. They lined up like soldiers in a swift, relentless march. The revelation ripped open the Adebayo household. Chief Olumide's love turned to thunder. He saw betrayal not only in his wife's panic, but in the institution he had trusted. The media smelled faint smoke and began to hover, but the Adebayos were swift to hush that. The public would later call it a scandal, but in that moment it was private, volcanic, and everything relevant to human hearts. Amaka, standing in the courtyard of the Adebayo mansion, with her son Obinna at her side. Faces wet with rain and hope. While Chief Olumide stood across from them, his eyes full of accusation and bewilderment, Ifunanya fell to her knees in front of her husband, palms folded, words escaping her like small birds. Dr. Emeka watched from the hospital doorway, numb with the weight of what he had done. As the truth spilled into the world, everyone realized that nothing could be the same. Houses that had once seemed solid shook. Loyalties frayed. Secrets, once pulled into the light, made sharp shadows. The chapter closed with the heavy question still in the air. What will a man with everything do when the thing he most wanted was taken by a poor woman he could have helped without theft? The city held its breath. End of Part 1. The truth about the boy's birth has been revealed. Part 2 will answer the terrible, glorious question. What will Chief Olumide do to his wife, the CMD, and the hospital? And what will become of the two boys and the two families now joined by a wound and a strange hope?